I'm going to pass you over to David. David, if you read the book, which please do, you will hear a lot from him. He's a very, very big presence in the book. He's doing a PhD candidate in heavy metal studies. Until I read this book, I did not know that existed, and now I'm really jealous. So David's going to come up and talk about existentialism for a little bit.
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Thank you.
Hello. I was told there'd be musical accompaniment, but that's okay. Can we get some? John? Just a little bit. Because the first line needs some support. Oh, only for a wee bit. Only for a wee bit. Give some simple one.
Modernity becoming monstrosity.
I'll firstly provide some definitions. So, in Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll, he defines monsters as categorical violations. They are things which fail to conform to a given symbolic structure. They are aberrations in some way because there's a normalcy which they break in some way. Alexa Wright extends this in her book of Monstrosity, saying, "The idea of monstrousness encapsulates the impossible, dreadful, amoral, inhuman, unspeakable, and even unthinkable qualities that lie at the periphery of human identity." But then she delineates this from monstrosity as opposed to monstrousness. Monstrosity is a tool of social control, a way of defining parts of the social order as being that aberration. And then the monster is the object or subject in which these two sort of characteristics cohere. And this is a paradoxical triad which calls to mind Jacques Lacan's three registers: imaginary, symbolic, and the real. The monster's grotesque appearance disgusts the norms of the imaginary, what we can see and interact with in terms of images. Monstrosity is identified in the subject by the symbolic law, and monstrousness itself lies outside of representation in the real. However, we need to add one further aspect to this model, that of the missing piece of our own subjectivity, the gap through which monstrousness extends. Bring it up.
A bone that gets stuck in your throat.
Monstrousness and monstrosity do not emanate solely from the great beyond, a frightening aspect of God's creation like a demon, or a new god such as Cthulhu, which we might call external monsters, and neither are they merely some form of unconscious projection or return of the repressed, such as in the dreamlike blurrings of zombies, vampires and ghosts, which we might call internal monsters. So Jacques Lacan's concept of extimacy, or intimate exteriority, or exterior intimacy, the idea that the thing that is closest to us is actually coming from the outside, is a very ideal concept to apply here. The horrifying little piece of the other, or das Ding, he later calls it petit objet art, is at once the heart of our subjective experience. It's the thing that we're constantly looking for, but at the same time it's only noticeable through the fact that we don't have it, through its absence. And it's simultaneously the exterior, the prehistoric other that we cannot access through symbolism or the image, that stretches deep into the vastness of outer space. The monster is, quote, something strange to me, although it is at the heart of me. Fictional monsters stand in for the unsymbolizable real on the symbolic imaginary plane, representing all manner of excess, violation, and escape from the currently designated normative, whilst unfolding out of the same conditions they struggle against. Consider one of the earliest horrors, Frankenstein, which festers with anxiety around the Enlightenment, while the plot relies crucially on science advances that heralded a new movement towards rationalism and empiricism, such as electrochemistry in the late 18th century. Monsters are at once the psychotic violence of real interiority and a means of designating symbolic outsiders and a partially nomadic, hybridized flux of imaginary pieces and, aberrational bits shoved together into the form of the monster. And this depends on the register in which we're moving through as we describe the monster, but all are latent in the idiot human body.
Something is trying to get out! It's too much! The missing piece is too much!
Heavy metal very much identifies with monsters, with Dina Weinstein correlating a symbol of chaos for her. It's a defining characteristic of the culture. Monstrosity can conversely be located in metal's acoustics. Distortion and loudness are excessive to the musical symbolic order, the clarity and wholeness of the sine wave. And fans describe their favoured tones in monstrous vernacular. All of you have done this, gnashing, snarling, brutal, disgusting, filthy, are all terms that we use to describe guitar tone all the time, for instance. They're all common terms of praise. Studying the paramusical texts of metal, such as lyrics, artwork and video, is evident that for heavy metal culture, monsters are to be found everywhere, within and without, in extimate relations. You can see this in the mascots, such as Eddie or Snaggletooth. They indicate this impulse, whereas other musical artists might use mascots occasionally, like the Bears from Grateful Dead, for instance. The frequency of monster-derived figures in metal, however, is kind of striking. And from the beginning of the culture, the finger of the monster has been treated ambiguously. In fantasy-oriented metal music, monsters are variously portrayed as threatening, fascinating, sympathetic and almighty, and often these portrayals shift within songs, such as in Iron Man by Black Sabbath. We start with empathising with them to an extent. By the end, Ozzy is warning us of the violent power that Iron Man is going to wreak on the people that he once saved, famously. For thrash metal or grindcore artists, late capitalist Western society is a monstrous entity in its own right, a behemoth which overdetermines, immiserates and constrains. Liam D calls this grotesque realism, while Ryan Moore, both in the same volume, argue that this is rather a mystification of power relations, but both identify how social forces are rendered in abject, disturbing and horrifying terms by metal bands. While it might appear that the monster is firmly separated from the lyricist and that this would therefore be a sort of resistant art, it would actually kind of be fairer to say that bands like Napalm Death emerge from within the capitalist order. They're like the voice of anguish that comes out of the thing that it is itself criticising. New metal bands such as Linkin Park, doom bands like Candlemass, DSBM artists such as Zastor, and metalcore artists like Killswitch Engage instead turn the monstrosity inward. It's lurking in affect and relationships and feelings, but there's a sense that there's a kind of monster desperate to burst out. Ronald Bogue and Reynolds and Press have suggested that death metal, in particular, has a fixation on radical bodily becomings, dismemberment, unnecessary surgery, exhumation, all the classics. And the narrator's perspective may be from either the sadistic wielder of violence or the victim. It doesn't really matter, it's ambiguous in that sense. And these last two approaches to monstrosity, the psychological and the bodily, find a clear expression, for instance, in the work of Slipknot. Right? They've got the disgusting masks and they used to sniff a dead crow before they went on stage and all that kind of thing. But all the lyrics are about inner torment and emotionality and so on. Even the pop-focused black metal style, engaged in monstrosity, both in lyrical and artistic content, and in the grotesquely excessive behaviour of the Sunset Strip lifestyle as well, which I would, the kind of rampant misogyny of the scene is part of their monstrosity. For heavy metal, monstrosity is a constant in regarding oneself, the world, and relationships in between.
No lies in way! There can be no escape from the chance to outrun oneself!
However, although metal's monstrosity can be seen as extimate merely through discussion of prominent subgenre themes and representations, it is in the process of creating metal music where this is profoundly felt, especially through the harsh voice which I'm using. This could also include the traditional kind of high-pitched falsetto screaming. There's a clip of Ian Gillan saying when he discovered that he could sing on a high A, it was an aberration. He just discovered it one day. It was kind of a complete outside to his musicality. Consider also Screaming Jay Hawkins, who kind of sets a precedent for this, like this extremely violent lyricisms that have a direct relationship to monstrosity as well. Rosie Overall argues, quote, "The metal voice is a voice of anguish. It is horrifying and destabilizing due to its opening onto the site of petit objet R in the Borromean knot. It indicates, moves towards, and confronts us with the real. The scream exceeds the musical symbolic order, compromises its own capacity for linguistic communication, and bears similarity to the terrifying roars of predators, which might allow us to conceive of it as an external monster, but as it emanates from the site of the voice, which according to Lacan is the only affect which does not lie, anxiety is the only truth for this kind of psychoanalysis, the scream expresses excessive inner pain, violence and rage, a sort of semblance of the internal monster. The scream therefore reveals the sort of Mobius strip-like motion of monstrosity that moves through rawest objectivity, my vocal flaps moving real hard, and the darkest subjectivity where it's coming from as an artistic expression simultaneously, a single conscious action that inevitably carries the little piece of the real.
Unstable! I'm going towards the real! And it's not what I said!
As seen throughout this presentation, monstrosity is represented across the heavy metal body in fashion and stage garb, and we can go through various subgenres to kind of explore it further. So, the elaborate spikes that black metal musicians wear, it's one writer calls it a martial/amorous lamella armor, this kind of plates of pure libidinal energy in the form of the spike. That, although intimidating in appearance, it only signifies ultimately the vulnerability of the wearer. Black metal musicians are not actually as hardcore as they want you to think they are. They just like wearing the armor. Although metalheads look scary, that we do adopt this scary appearance partly as a result of our own alienation to an extent. And we develop a style that extensively uses protective materials as well, like denim and steel and leather and so on. Although the subculture's primary activities of standing, talking, drinking and occasionally moshing really hardly call for that. It's not necessary to have this kind of durable armor on all the time. But it's not just compensatory. It's also a kind of identification with the monster. We can also see this in performance features. So, the horns, obviously, popularised by Dio, who used it with Black Sabbath and learnt it from his Italian grandma. And it's appeared in other things as well, such as Coven's 1969 album, Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. It's on there before Dio started using it. Commonly, the horns are given as a semi-salute to performers and are often extended above the head, go right over here. Kind of deixis, which is a fancy word for pointing at things. But that's important, right? Because we cut through the air as we do this. It's what we call a fancy word for it is like a striation, a cutting through of smooth airspace, right? For heavy metal performers, parts of the body become sort of little monsters that further this screaming drive. Mosh pits, which feature some informal regulations and etiquette, nevertheless allow us to experience colliding dichotomies of pleasure, pain, order, chaos, individuality, collective. A monster of writhing muscle and fabric, barely coherent, struggling against itself. The claw, as well, you seen the black metal claw? Yeah. Or the crab walk. You ever seen the scuttling? Yes? And even windmilling and headbanging with long hair, all of these extend the body's form outwards, make it bigger than it is normally. Like bears when they stand up to scare people. And they make the body monstrous by introducing, as I said, spikes, angles, violently cutting through and striating space, extending beyond symbolically appropriate limits, and approaching Bataille's dialectical opposite of geometric regularity. At the metal concert, the invocatory drive is extended across the metal body in the form of the huge PA speakers carrying the noise through everybody. Monstrosity at that point becomes everywhere. Everywhere.
Invading space! Defining the temple! Summoning from the dead! Reaching from the center! Approaching the ash!
From the evidence provided, I claim that heavy metal fundamentally recognises monstrosity of humanity at large, with all of the ambiguity that entails. Most other cultural forms and philosophies stress that monsters, as emblematic of the not good, monsters are typically conceived of as evil, but monsters are in one place or position, in opposition to some concept of the good, right? They're a dialectical pair to goodness. American political culture, perfectly kind of illustrates this. Both parties lay blame squarely at the feet of the base of the other side. It's very clear where the monsters lie for most political debate. In both cases, it's concentrated into a specific group, which stands in, really, for a broader antagonism. In fact, it's not that Trump voters are the specific group that's at fault here. There's something more complex going on there. There's a whole economic question, but for Democrat voters, it's easier to say it's Trump voters specifically, and simultaneously it's easier for Trump voters to say it's all the Democrats' fault, when there's actually more going on. Heavy metal, however, adopts monstrosity for its own, while simultaneously locating monstrousness as a constant, maybe a universal even, that can trouble any notion of the absolute good. And given the trajectory of philosophy and history over the past few centuries, I would contend this is actually far from a shocking or unreasonable position, as notions of the good, like God, the nation, the family, the economy, progress, have been successively attacked by scores of critical theorists. Scholars since the 1990s have argued that heavy metal follows some kind of critical impulse, linking to Marx, Nietzsche, Adorno, and other writers, Deleuze as well. I argue that Todd McGowan and Kapoor and Zalua's arguments for negative universality or fundamental antagonism are perfectly applicable to heavy metal's universal monstrosity, which locates and represents every facet of antagonism and failure in contemporary society.
Within every perfect ideal, Lord is protected, oh Lord. Absolute decay!
Adopting a perspective of universal monstrosity offers perhaps the most evocative and accurate analyses of postmodernity, such as Marx's vampiric capitalism, counterposed by the famed spectre of communism. More recently, theorists such as Baudrillard, Nick Land, Reza Negarestani, and Ian Wright have described various structures and systems as taking on monstrous, indifferent intelligences of their own, collectively depicting a self-constructing techno-capitalism which monstrously enslaves all of its participants on behalf of the system's own logic or on behalf of the real logic of resources themselves, as in Cyclonopedia by Negarestani. Comparisons can be easily drawn to a host of metal bands' interpretations of advanced technological society: Judas Priest, Electric Eye, Future Breed Machine by Meshuggah. And again, the perspective of the narrator is often very ambiguous across the field, with some tracks speaking on behalf of the machine and others representing the subjugated human subject trapped within. This ambiguity is in fact instructive. Not only does metal often engage in sardonic and satirical lyricism, but famously, the genre's politics are inconsistent in comparison to other youth cultures such as punk, reggae, or hip-hop. Featuring all stripes from normative conservatism to outright fascism to communism and anarchism, there are really no stable political axioms held throughout the culture. This is precisely because of metal's short-circuiting effect, as described above. In heavy metal, imaginary monsters, i.e. the artwork and monsters described in the lyrics, compound with symbolic monstrosity in musical distortion, performative striation, and the kind of outlaw persona, the sort of biker look, while supported by real monstrousness, the violence of capitalism which makes possible the production and consumption of metal music, and further, the actual real violence committed by metal musicians on several occasions. In amongst this is the anguished metal voice which bellows from the perspective of wrathful God and pathetic victim, professional, entertainer, and cultural self-exile, destructive critic, and grateful beneficiary of postmodernity. A remainder of human anxiety that struggles to be heard. Does not lie. The universal monstrosity of humanity conveyed by heavy metal culture, leads us to Bataille's own conclusion that in the age of mechanically reproducible culture, there is no human nature upon which we can be grounded. We are, were, and will be monsters as we travel further from concepts like the great chain of being. How does heavy metal reckon with this? The answers are still ambiguous. Metal fans often describe experiences of catharsis and community, but these accounts must be tempered with others who describe extensive sexism within metal scenes. Similarly, while some artists encourage their fans to despair in the face of the monstrous world, many others encourage their fans to celebrate and embrace their incompleteness and otherness. However, arguing that metal is a social good misses the point somewhat, given that metal stubbornly circumvents articulating the good beyond the vaguest of signifiers like freedom, power, authenticity, and of course for the Manowar fans just saying the word metal over and over again, which are often deeply ambiguous as values themselves. You know, what kind of freedom are we talking about? What kind of power are we talking about? Rather than thinking of it as something which enunciates a kind of certain social good, we should think of metal as an analytic tool, a means of traversing the world as a monstrous fantasy which through abjection and excess makes plainer the ambiguity and groundlessness of social relations and concepts. We were behind the veil.
We were behind the veil! We were behind the veil!
It has been observed that for all the outsideness and savagery in metal performance and the defiant attitude taken up by metal fans, the culture largely carries norms, demographics, and ideological bounds from the mainstream society it opposes. You know, we don't leave society. We do the normal thing for the most part. Its membership is still primarily composed of dominant ethnic groups within each locality, mostly male, and mainly in the upper working and lower middle classes. And the prevalence of heavy metal and its fascination with monsters within these groups, those who lack the identity markers of marginalisation, surely indicates the monstrosity of the current order. Indeed, real violence in metal culture, such as church burnings and murder, is enacted by the very stuff of normalcy, a monstrous jouissance of the postmodern West, a huge surplus enjoyment, like, just insane. Yet, as Scott notes, the monstrous rhetoric of extreme metal bands usually descends into a parody of itself, which not only helps to accommodate metal within popular culture at large through leaning on its potential for ridicule, but also further complicates understandings of metal culture. It is both a crude joke and deadly serious at the same time. This ambiguity between entertainment and exploitation, consumption and violence is made explicit in metal culture through the universal monster. My final claim is that heavy metal is not concerned with monstrousness merely because of some deeply held obsession with the other, which would be a kind of neurotic diagnosis, nor because it allows fans to transgress and embody opposition, which would be a perverse diagnosis, and not only because monsters are a solid figure, a master to rail against, which is the hysteric diagnosis. Rather, I claim heavy metal makes normative, unconscious logic explicit, dragging it into the representational order, and given the inhuman other aspect of JR present in every speaking being, metal's relationship to monstrousness is inevitable. Metal famously says what we are not meant to say, and I would extend this from the edicts of, niceness and manners and even law to our own superego. We are not meant to say that the world and ourselves are monstrous, aberrant, and incomplete. Rather, we are directed towards normality, stability, and wholeness in contemporary ideology. But by dredging up our extimate monstrosity through image, performance, voice, and rhetoric, heavy metal takes on the role of symptom for the world's profound sickness. To be a monster is not the end nor the start.
It is the means! Monstrosity is the means! Always already! In and two and four and of ourselves!
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David Burke. Woo!